I have always thought of myself as someone who knows my neighborhood inside and out. I grew up running around these streets, cutting through blocks to get to school or my friends' houses faster. So when I left a club meeting and it was already getting dark, I didn't think twice about taking the fastest way home. It was just another Tuesday, but the silence on the street felt heavier than usual, you know? That gut feeling that something's off, even though everything looks perfectly calm. The whole town seemed to have fallen into some kind of trance. Not a soul in sight, just the cold wind making me hunch my shoulders. I was about halfway home when my phone buzzed, and I nearly dropped it, not gonna lie. Neighborhood alert, the notification read. I quickly opened it, and my blood ran cold. Warning. Suspicious individual spotted near 5th and Pine Street. Avoid going outside. I was less than 2 blocks away from there. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest and keep moving, but something inside me whispered that I should change my route. I decided to take the shortcut through the old basketball court, a choice that seemed questionable in hindsight. I hadn't even taken a few steps down the path when the silence turned into an uncomfortable buzzing in my ears. Every rustling leaf, every creak in the distance seemed amplified. The darkness there was thicker, and the streetlights barely reached that forgotten corner of the neighborhood. The first thing that made me freeze was the sound of footsteps, soft, rhythmic, like someone trying to be extra careful not to be heard. I stopped walking for a second and held my breath, and the footsteps stopped, too. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I glanced around, but all I saw were shadows and the outlines of trees. Then I took a cautious step forward, testing. The footsteps started up again, this time closer. It was official. I wasn't alone. It felt like every hair on my body stood up at once. I tried to think fast, recalling the layout of that damn basketball court, the nearby houses, and the alleys. If I went back the way I came, I'd be out in the open, with no chance to hide. I swallowed hard, deciding my best bet was to keep moving forward and hope that whoever was following me would lose my trail. I kept walking, trying to look as calm as possible, even though every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run. With every step I took, the footsteps behind me echoed louder. The clatter of something metal falling in a nearby alley almost made me trip. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The fear had fully taken over, and all I could think was how much this felt like a twisted game of cat and mouse. I decided to change tactics. Instead of going straight, I started zigzagging, weaving in and out of the little paths that cut through the neighborhood. That's when I realized that whoever was following me knew the area even better than I did. No matter how much I tried to lose them, the footsteps kept coming, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but never completely disappearing. I started to recognize familiar spots: the old graffitied warehouse, the empty park with the rusty. Keeping calm was getting harder. My mind raced, desperately searching for anything, any idea that could help me get out of there faster. Then, I remembered the abandoned house on the corner of Maple, the last place anyone would think to look for someone hiding. I knew that the abandoned house on Maple was a risk. It had been boarded up for years, with wooden planks covering the windows and a rusty chain locking the gate. But at that moment, it felt like my best shot. I reached the corner, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I was sure I saw a shadow move. Without thinking twice, I ran to the gate and started tugging at the chain. My hands were shaking so much I could barely focus, but luckily, the chain gave way with a loud snap that made me freeze for a second. I squeezed through the gate, shutting it behind me as quietly as I could, and rushed to the side of the house. I hid behind a pile of old moldy wood that smelled like decay. The silence wrapped around me again, but this time it was almost unbearable. I crouched there, trying to steady my breathing and listening for the tiniest sound. Suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps on the sidewalk. Whoever it was had stopped right in front of the house. I could hear the creak of wood as they pushed on the gate, testing the chain. I held my breath and prayed they'd give up and leave. The gate creaked again, louder this time, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. The person outside seemed seriously tempted to come in. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. every muscle in my body so tense it started to ache. Then I heard footsteps moving along the fence, slowly, like they were searching for another way in. My mind was spinning. What if they managed to climb over? What if they saw me hiding there? All I could do was sit and hope that they wouldn't know. Every second felt like an eternity, and cold sweat trickled down my back. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet again, but in a way that made me even more on edge. I peeked through a gap in the wooden planks of the pile, but I couldn't see anything, and that was somehow scarier. Where had they gone? Why had they stopped? I tried to take a deep breath and stay calm, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That's when I heard a faint noise, like someone breathing close by. My stomach twisted into a knot. I knew I wasn't alone, and the fear rooted me to the spot. I stayed as still as possible, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was echoing in my head. The sound of breathing was too close, like the person was right there, just behind the pile of wood. My thoughts were a mess, scrambling to come up with a plan. If I made a run for it, they'd see me. If I stayed, I risked getting found. But running wasn't an option yet. I waited, hoping that whatever it was, would make the next move. Each second dragged on, and all I could think about was how badly I wanted to be home, safe. Out of nowhere, a noise in the distance shattered the silence, like a can rolling across the ground. The sound made my pursuer move, and I heard their footsteps heading toward it. I seized the moment. Without thinking twice, I slipped out from behind the pile of wood and bolted toward the back of the house. My body was on autopilot, driven by pure fear, pushing me not to look back. I found a low fence, jumped over it without hesitation, and kept running until my legs burned from the effort. I ran nonstop, the cold air stinging my lungs, until I reached a street with better lighting. There, everything felt more normal. Houses with porch lights on, a car driving by slowly, even a dog barking in the distance. It was like I had crossed from a nightmare back into reality. I slowed down, trying to calm myself, but I still glanced over my shoulder every 2 seconds, expecting someone to step out of the shadows. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone when I tried to check the time. It wasn't even 9 yet, but it felt like I had just lived through hours of terror. I walked quickly the rest of the way home, barely believing it when I finally saw my front door. I rushed inside, locking everything behind me, and stood there in the hallway, trying to convince myself I was safe. My parents hadn't come home from work yet, so the quiet inside the house felt almost as suffocating as the silence outside. I climbed the stairs and went straight to my room, collapsing onto my bed, still shaking all over. Even now, telling this story, I can't quite explain what happened or who was following me. But every time I pass through that area, I can't help but get the same chills. Like the danger is still there, watching, waiting for another chance.
I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary that afternoon. I had just left college and made a quick stop at the grocery store to grab a few things my mum had asked for. The place was almost empty, with only a handful of people strolling quietly down the aisles, picking up stuff like milk or packs of bread. I was distracted, checking the shopping list on my phone, when the intercom crackled and made me freeze. The manager's voice sounded tense, almost choked up. "Attention, customers. For your safety, we ask that everyone stay inside the store and that the doors be locked immediately. There is an armed individual in the area." The fear in his voice made my stomach twist into a knot. I glanced around, and people's reactions were instant. Shopping carts abandoned in the middle of the aisles, people running to hide behind shelves. The calm silence of the store was swallowed up by the sound of hurried footsteps and heavy breathing. A mother pulled her little kid close, and an older couple stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart was racing, but I knew I had to keep my cool. I pushed my cart aside and crouched down behind a section of canned goods, trying to figure out what to do. The fear that someone could burst in at any moment was paralyzing. I stayed crouched there, straining to hear anything that might give a clue about what was happening outside. Some people were whispering to each other, trying to figure out if the danger was close or if it was safe to move. Then, out of nowhere, an elderly man, probably in his 70s, started to panic. He was leaning against a shelf, breathing rapidly and clutching his chest like he was about to pass out. I looked around, hoping someone else could help, but everyone was just as terrified as I was. I couldn't just leave the man there, so I moved closer, trying to sound calm. "Sir, you're gonna be all right. Just breathe slowly, okay?" I tried to guide him to a safer corner, but he was so scared his legs were like jelly. By now, the tension in the store was so thick that any noise sounded like a gunshot. Every fridge door closing or a package dropping to the floor made everyone jump. I helped the man sit down on the floor, keeping one eye on the store entrance. My heart was pounding hard, and I knew that if the armed person came in, it would be total chaos. All I could think about was how we'd get out of this without anyone getting hurt. The old man finally managed to sit down, but he was still pale and shaking. I stayed beside him, trying to stay calm while listening to the muffled sounds of people moving around, looking for places to hide. An older woman, who looked just as scared, came over and handed him a bottle of water. He nodded weakly in thanks, still trying to get his breathing under control. I just wanted it all to be over, but the uncertainty was crushing. The sound of distant sirens started getting closer, and for a split second, I felt a bit of relief, hoping the police were already handling the situation. But that relief didn't last long. The front doors of the store made a loud noise, and what sounded like a scuffle started near the entrance. Someone outside was trying to get in, and the staff were doing their best to keep the doors locked. The panic came back in full force. A few people started crying, and I felt my heart jump into my throat. I looked over at the elderly man beside me, who seemed a little calmer, but was still visibly shaken. I tried to think of what I'd do if the worst happened, but there wasn't much I could do. It felt like being trapped in a nightmare with no easy way out. The tension in the store was so thick, it was hard to even breathe. I crouched down lower, trying to stay out of sight as the noise near the entrance continued. Whoever was outside was really trying to force their way in, and the sound echoed through the store. For a moment, everything went so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. My heart kept pounding, like it was trying to break out of my chest. I looked down the aisle ahead of me, where some other shoppers were hiding, and the fear on their faces was a perfect mirror of what I was feeling. Suddenly, the store's sound system let out a loud static noise, making everyone jump. It was the manager again, this time sounding more desperate. "The police are on their way. Please stay where you are." Even though he was trying to reassure us, you could hear the fear in his voice. A man next to me mumbled, "Hope they get here fast," and I could only agree silently. The elderly man I was helping started to move, trying to stand up, so I gave him a hand, even though my own legs were still shaking. We were all doing our best to hold it together, but the fear was real and crushing. As I was helping the old man up, a sound froze me in place. What sounded like glass shattering. The whole store went silent again, like everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. I waited, hoping it was just my imagination, but the noise was definitely real. One of the store employees ran to the back, probably trying to see if there was another way out or something, but that only made everyone more panicked. An older lady started sobbing quietly, and I saw a teenage girl next to her trying to comfort her, even though she was clearly terrified herself. I was so focused on listening for any more noises that I almost didn't notice the sound of sirens finally getting closer. The relief was almost instant, but no one dared to fully relax yet. The next few minutes felt like they dragged on forever, each second longer than the last. Finally, we heard strong voices coming from outside, probably the police taking charge of the situation. One of the employees ran over to tell us it was safe, and I remember letting out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. I helped the old man get up all the way, and together, along with the other customers, we slowly emerged from that surreal nightmare. When we stepped out of the store, the scene outside was chaotic. Police cars were blocking off the street, and officers were giving instructions, trying to keep everything under control. We were escorted to a safe area, where employees and customers gathered, all visibly shaken. The elderly man I had helped gave me a weak smile and thanked me. Still looking like he couldn't believe what had just happened, I sat down on the curb, trying to process everything, my body finally starting to relax, even though my mind kept replaying the panic of being trapped inside. Even now, when I think back to that afternoon, I get chills. It's not every day that you find yourself in such a dangerous, out-of-control situation. I still wonder what would have happened if the armed individual had managed to get inside. But thankfully, the police arrived just in time to stop anything worse from happening. I learned that day that no matter how familiar a place feels, the unexpected can always strike. And sometimes, the only thing that keeps you steady is helping someone else out, even if you're scared out of your mind yourself. Ever since then, I can't go grocery shopping without staying alert for any strange sound or suspicious movement.
I never thought I'd end up teaching a math class in what felt like a scene straight out of a thriller movie. It was just a regular evening at the community center, and I was filling in for a teacher who couldn't make it. Only a few students had shown up, maybe 7 or 8 scattered around the desks, focused as I tried to explain the equation on the board. That's when the classroom door burst open and a staff member came in looking pale as a ghost. "Lockdown," he announced, his voice shaking. "We have an intruder in the building. Lock everything and hide." For a moment, no one moved. It was like everyone was trying to process if this was actually happening or not. My heart skipped a beat, but there wasn't time to feel scared. I turned to the students and said as firmly as I could, "Quick, let's push the desks and block the door." They started moving, some still looking dazed, but we managed to put together a makeshift barricade. Then everyone scrambled to hide behind desks and shelves full of books. I crouched near the door, every muscle in my body tensed up, listening to every single sound from the hallway. The minutes dragged on and the silence was almost unbearable. That's when we heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, like someone was purposefully getting closer. I wondered what I'd do if the intruder tried to break in. Fight or just wait it out? The footsteps stopped right in front of the door, and I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I tried not to breathe too loudly, afraid even the smallest sound would give us away. I glanced at the students, some with wide, terrified eyes, others with shaky hands, trying to stay quiet. A woman in her 50s was clutching a rosary, whispering prayers under her breath. I had no idea what to do. My mind was a mess, torn between the instinct to protect everyone and the paralyzing fear that if I messed up, we'd all be in serious danger. We heard the doorknob rattle like someone was trying to get in. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears. The staff member who had warned us was holed up in another room, so we were on our own. I grabbed a chair, ready to do something, anything, if the intruder broke through. My mind was racing, going over every possible scenario, but none of them were good. Suddenly, the footsteps started moving away, fading down the hallway. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, but the relief was short-lived. We were still locked inside, not sure what would happen next. The room stayed deathly quiet, and I could hardly believe the footsteps were really gone. My shoulders were stiff, and my mind was still racing, trying to figure out our next move. One of the students, a young guy with tattoos on his arms, looked at me and whispered, "Are we safe now?" I shrugged, trying to look more confident than I felt. "Let's stay put," I whispered back. Leaving the room felt too risky, but the thought of staying wasn't much better. The tension was so thick you could almost feel it in the air, and breathing normally felt impossible. Minutes passed, and then the silence was broken by the sound of distant sirens. Relief washed over us. Finally, the police were here. Still, no one dared to move. We waited a little longer, listening for any sign that it was safe. At last, a strong voice echoed down the hallway, telling everyone to stay put while they secured the building. I stood up slowly, trying to reassure the students. At least help had arrived, but the feeling of being vulnerable didn't just vanish. We were still stuck there, waiting for the nightmare to officially be over. We stood there, straining to hear the noises from the hall. The voices of police officers echoed through the building, mixed with the sound of doors opening and closing. Even with the police on site, no one seemed able to fully relax. I looked around at the students, each dealing with their fear in their own way. An older man, who had been silent the whole time, closed his eyes and let out a long sigh, like he'd been holding his breath since it all started. The woman with the rosary kept whispering her prayers, and all I wanted was for it to end so everyone could get out safely. After what felt like forever, a police officer knocked on the door, telling us it was safe to come out. We moved the makeshift barricade and everyone stood up, a mix of exhaustion and relief on their faces. The room felt tiny and suffocating, and stepping into the bright hallway felt like a breath of fresh air I never knew I needed. One of the officers explained that the intruder had been caught and that we were no longer in danger. His words were comforting, but the fear we'd felt in that room wasn't going to disappear quickly. We all left, grateful to be safe, but I knew that experience would stay with us for a long time.
That morning seemed pretty normal. I was in the middle of science class, practically dozing off on my textbook, when the classroom phone rang. The teacher answered, looked at me with a serious expression, and said, "Go to the office." "It's about your brother." My stomach instantly twisted into knots. My younger brother, the one I always tease but honestly love to pieces, was there an emergency? I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of the room, my heart pounding. When I got to the office, the receptionist was standing there, looking kind of confused, and there was a man I'd never seen before standing next to him, wearing a smile that sent chills down my spine. "Hey," the man said, way too friendly. "I'm a friend of your family. Your brother had an issue, and your parents asked me to come get you." He nodded toward a black pickup truck parked outside. My mind was a mess of worry, but something about this guy didn't sit right with me. He was well dressed, but I didn't recognize him from any family gatherings or school events. I started asking questions. "How is he? What kind of emergency?" The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting to the floor before he replied in a voice that sounded rehearsed. "Just come with me, and I'll explain everything on the way." I felt my suspicion grow even stronger. Something about the way he was talking didn't add up. And why wouldn't my parents call me directly if it was such a serious emergency? I glanced around the office, hoping to spot a staff member who could help, but the place was oddly empty. "I think I should call my parents first," I said, trying to stay calm, though my voice came out shaky. The man's friendly expression turned into a scowl, and he stepped closer. "We don't have time for that," he snapped, the fake kindness disappearing from his face. My whole body went into high alert, and every instinct I had screamed not to go with him. That's when I noticed something odd. He was holding the truck keys, but his hands were shaking slightly. It was a small detail, but it made me even more certain that something was wrong. I turned slowly, pretending to reach for my phone in my pocket, but really I was getting ready to run. I needed help fast. My heart was pounding so loudly, I felt like everyone in the building could hear it. As he stepped closer again, I did the only thing that came to mind. I took a step back and bolted down the hallway, shouting for help as loud as I could. My voice echoed down the empty hallways, and the adrenaline made my legs move faster than I ever thought possible. The man tried to follow me, but seemed hesitant to make an even bigger scene. I turned the corner, nearly slipping on the polished floor, and saw the principal stepping out of a room, looking confused by my shouting. "There's a stranger trying to take me." I managed to gasp out, breathless. The principal immediately ran toward me, and when she looked at the man coming after me, her face went serious. She yelled at him to stop, and that finally made him hesitate, like he realized the game was up. The guy turned around and bolted for the exit, and the principal grabbed the phone to call school security. A few staff members showed up, drawn by the commotion, and I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath while explaining everything. My mind was still racing, struggling to process what had just happened. Soon enough, security and even the police were at the school, and I had to repeat the story a few more times. They told me the man had gotten away before anyone could catch him, but what scared me the most was thinking about what could have happened if I had The police told me I did the right thing by not trusting him and running. They said in situations like this, it's always better to be safe than sorry. I was still shaking, and my friends started gathering around, trying to calm me down. The school called my parents, and they got there pretty quickly, worried, but so grateful that I was okay. The whole thing felt surreal. I never thought something like this could happen to me, especially at school, a place where I always felt safe. The staff started tightening security, and the principal promised me they'd do everything they could to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Still, to this day, that weird feeling hasn't left me. I keep wondering how the stranger knew I had a younger brother, or how he managed to seem convincing enough to fool the front office. It's scary to think about how fragile our sense of safety can be. Now, whenever I'm at school, I pay a little more attention to my surroundings, keeping an eye out for anything that seems off. It's not every day you experience something like that, but the lesson stuck with me. Trusting your instincts can really save you from a situation that could have ended way worse.
The plan was simple, a weekend camping trip with my friends at the national park. We'd planned everything carefully, bringing along tents, food, flashlights, and even a small portable grill. During the day, the place felt like paradise, crystal clear rivers, towering trees, and the fresh scent of pine in the air. We spent the afternoon hiking and goofing around, laughing at Carlos's bad jokes and Lucas's failed attempts to start a fire. But when night fell, the vibe completely shifted. The trees that had felt welcoming earlier turned into creepy shadows, and the silence was so thick that every noise seemed louder. We were gathered around the campfire, trying to ignore the cold that was getting stronger, when we first heard the strange sounds. It was distant at first, like branches snapping, but in a way that made everyone stop and glance at each other. "It's probably just a deer or some other animal," Aina said, trying to sound casual. But even she didn't look too convinced. The noises kept coming, getting closer and closer. That feeling of being watched settled in, and a shiver ran down my spine. We tried to keep talking, but the fire didn't feel as comforting anymore, like its flames were the only thing separating us from whatever was out there. A cold wind started blowing harder, making the trees around us sway and cast shadows that danced almost menacingly. We tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine, but no one could ignore the sounds creeping closer. Then Aina pointed at something on the ground near our tents. In the firelight, we saw fresh footprints. They weren't normal boot prints like ours. These were big, strange, and seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Who else would be out here at this hour? Marcos whispered, his voice low and tense. The feeling of panic started to build, and my heart began to race. We tried using our phones, but of course there was no signal. Lucas suggested we should head to the ranger station, but it was miles away, and that would mean trekking through the forest in the dark. The campfire, which had been a source of comfort, now felt like a trap, highlighting our presence to whatever or whoever might be watching. We sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in. The question was, stay and brace for the worst, or venture into the darkness in search of help. Carlos, who was usually the bravest of us, suggested we split up to explore, but that idea got shut down immediately. The thought of being separated felt like an even bigger nightmare. We decided to stick together, at least until we figured out what to do. That's when we heard it, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the woods, dangerously close to our camp. The fire crackled, lighting up for a brief moment, something moving at the edge of the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was a tall figure, just standing there, watching us. We all held our breath, trying not to make a sound that would draw any more attention. Marcos started whispering that we should make a run for the car, but the vehicle was a good distance away from the campsite, parked in a clearing that now felt impossible to reach safely. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and we just stood there, frozen, too scared to even blink. Ana was gripping my hand so tightly that my fingers were starting to tingle. The tension was unbearable, and every second felt longer than the last. We knew staying put was dangerous, but the idea of running through the dark forest, not knowing what was out there, was just as terrifying. We were stuck between two bad choices, and no one knew what to do. Finally, the silence was shattered by a sound that seemed to come from all directions, a high-pitched whistle, repeating over and over like someone was trying to get our attention. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Lucas held up a flashlight, pointing it into the darkness, but the beam barely lit up a few feet ahead before being swallowed by the forest. The feeling of being surrounded by something invisible was suffocating. We decided to put out the campfire, hoping we'd blend in better, even though it meant sitting in complete darkness. It was a risk, but staying exposed felt worse. We huddled together near the tents, trying to come up with a plan. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we heard more footsteps. This time, they were faster, like someone was running around the campsite, taunting us or trying to scare us. My gut was telling me to run, but where to? With no cell service and the forest feeling like a maze, we'd get lost easily. Fear had taken over the whole group, and I could see the panic on everyone's faces. "We need to go now," Ana whispered, her voice shaking. But before we could move, something or someone threw a big branch that landed just a few feet from us. That was the final push we needed to act, even though we had no guarantee it was the right decision. With no time left to hesitate, we agreed that our best shot was to run together to the car. We grabbed our backpacks quickly, leaving the tents and anything we couldn't carry behind. Fueled by fear, we sprinted through the forest, using our flashlights to guide us. Branches scratched our faces, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot seemed way too loud. But nothing compared to the noise behind us. Whatever or whoever it was, they were chasing us, and it sounded like they were getting closer. My mind was in full-on panic mode, but all I could do was keep running, not daring to look back. We finally made it to the clearing where the car was parked, almost collapsing with relief. Lucas fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and we all scrambled inside, locking the doors as fast as we could. The silence came back, but the fear was still there, like it had climbed into the car with us. We sat there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The headlights shone into the forest, but we didn't see anything moving. It was like whatever had chased us had melted away into the darkness. No one spoke for a long time until, with our hearts still racing, we finally decided to get out of there and never look back.
These stories show how the unexpected can turn everyday situations into moments of pure terror, testing our courage and survival instincts. From the quiet neighborhood to the campsite in the woods, Each experience is a reminder that the fear of the unknown is real, and that sometimes trusting our gut can make all the difference. If you love spooky stories and want more like these, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Who knows? The next story might just be yours.